All right, we're going to get started. Good morning. Good afternoon to some of you. Here we are. We have another InnContext conference talk. Today we're going to talk about pandemic and climate crisis towards a new social contract with Manuel Pulgar Vidal. I will ask you to keep your microphones off. At the end, we will have a Q&A. We have interpretation available. You can choose English or Spanish. You do that by pushing on the interpretation button down at the bottom of the screen. If you are hearing, by any chance, two languages at once, you will need to update your version of Zoom. We're going to invite Ramiro Fernandez to open the session for us. Go ahead, Ramiro. The interpreter's hearing a lot of background noise. Ramiro is asking that everyone who is not speaking, that they mute themselves. Franco is helping us out with that. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. As Franco said, this is one webinar in a series of webinars that we have organized here at Avena Foundation. The idea is that we needed to create spaces for reflection, especially as we face the current pandemic. It's probably one of the most serious crises that we have faced as humans since World War II. And we have felt the impacts on our infrastructure and in many spheres: health, economic, climate, among others. It is a global crisis. It affects all countries. However, the impact that is felt is not equal everywhere. And this crisis has actually deepened inequality. Many developed countries have different capacities to respond to this crisis. The impact felt internally is also different across countries. The most vulnerable sectors of our countries here in Latin America, for example, the trash pickers cooperative, we've heard from them to understand how they are facing the crisis. We have to look at the most vulnerable sectors first. We still don't understand the full consequences of this pandemic. But we do need to stop. We need to think, look into the future. And we need to understand how the wider planetary crisis is related to this health crisis. And by that I mean the loss of biodiversity and the climate crisis. There are points of connection. These two crises are related. But what can we affirm from this crisis that we are going through right now? What we see is that this has been a huge failure in terms of managing risk. If we look at the pandemic and how it has affected our lives, the climate crisis actually puts the planet, life on the planet, at risk. The failure that we have seen in risk management, managing these risks, we can learn from that failure and apply it to how we are managing climate change. And so from there, we are actually, for us, this is an old friend. Actually, the photo there, he looks pretty young in that photo. Yeah, the truth is, I mean, an old friend, right? He looks young in the picture. We have, we've been friends with you and been working with you for at least 20 years. Manuel, we've we've all been thinking collectively about the relationship between the pandemic and climate crisis. What challenges, what opportunities are there for the future? And so here we are, inviting you to talk to us about this. So let us know what your thoughts are, and then Paula is, who is responsible for programs at Avina, will give us a few reflections and host a Q&A. Well, it'll be a moderated Q&A. All of the participants can turn on their microphones and participate. All right, Manuel, over to you. Thank you. Thank you, Ramiro. Thank you to everyone who is participating. There are hundreds of people here on this platform, and I'm very grateful for your attention. So we're going to start. I want you to think about some of the things that Ramiro said in his introduction. This morning we actually had a meeting on the same topic, and I'll share some of that. Ramiro, in his introduction, talked about crisis. This is probably the most severe crisis that we have experienced or faced. I had a friend from Cambridge this morning on our meeting, and he said this is the realest crisis we have experienced. It's probably, apart from climate change, the only crisis that we have had to face. And so in that meeting, I thought, what are the conditions that make something a crisis? This is the biggest or the only crisis that is fruit of human arrogance, and we don't have an answer. We probably only call something a crisis when we don't know how to respond to it. That's where I want to start, because what I'm asking you, I'm trying to appeal to your humility, to all of our humility. We are always having to face humanitarian crises, or rather crises that affect humanity. There was another topic that came up this morning in our meeting. Inequality is deepening. We discussed this morning in our meeting. We're seeing deepening inequality, but the inequality is becoming more equal, if that makes sense. What was said is that what we are facing on a world level is what people from underdeveloped or developing countries face daily. When we have our brothers and sisters in the Amazon who have to face dengue epidemics, for example, or hepatitis in indigenous communities. We don't have an understanding of that reality. But now we're all on equal footing. This epidemic has forced us all to think about, to face the consequences. Here, I'm not going to give you a presentation. I'm going to try to really encourage you. The question was, how do I inspire? How do I inspire you all? We have to think of a new way of thinking. We have to understand. We have to understand the pandemic, and that is giving us lessons. And we have to understand these lessons that it offers. And then from there, we need to move the world into a new space, into a new way of speaking. Into a new way of thinking, into a new social contract. We have to, just as we saw in the 14th, 15th century with the bubonic plague, we have to relinquish our place at the center of our existence and give that prime spot over to the planet. We have to participate in the planet. That's a big challenge. But I think using that, we can build a future that we all want. I'm going to be brief, but I think there's a couple of things I can share to inform our talk today. What has this pandemic taught us? We all understand it has showed us how the planet is one system, and we have really been estranged from that reality. I was reading a book by the ex-minister of Colombia. And what he said in this book was, humans have created the concept of nature in order to make ourselves supernatural. And you know what? The Pope has published something to the fact that we are not here to dominate the world. We are part of nature. The planet has its limits, and we are starting to understand that, and we have really been pushing those limits. The patterns of consumption and production are taking us way beyond the planet's limits. If we continue to behave, then we're going to be in the way we have been, we're going to be in a real crisis in 15, 20, 30 years. We are seeing a loss of habitats, and that means that we don't have the plant and animal resources that we have now. For example, with illegal consumption of animal and plant products, and that is depleting air and water resources. And if we continue on that path, we're going to see another pandemic soon. We're all in quarantine, and it looks like, interestingly enough, that the planet is able to breathe for a second. Let's look at the second lesson learned. We've talked about emergencies, climate emergencies, planet emergencies. You know, we all have our protest posters. But it seems like we've been screaming this, but no one seemed to register that it was an actual emergency. But with this pandemic, we all recognized this is an emergency, and we changed our behaviors. We did social distancing. We started to quarantine. We started to build up our public sanitation and our health system. We started to take measures to try to protect the economy. That's what you do in an emergency. But in COP25, I don't remember who said it, when the UK and the United States, during the Second World War, they put pedal to the metal and mobilized all of their resources to face the crisis. But no one mobilized resources in that way on behalf of the crisis that we were facing at a climate level. And so that's the second lesson learned. We have to make sure that it registers as an emergency, that people appropriately mobilize resources. Finally, we said that now the inequalities have been equalized. Sure, the poor are more vulnerable, but we are all vulnerable. When it comes to consumption, production, and the other sectors, we understand that we are all vulnerable. We may all lack access to water, access to appropriate health care. We are all weak, we are all vulnerable, and so we need to rethink all of these systems in the face of a new world that has been changed as a result of this pandemic. We're actually just seeing the tip of the iceberg. we're seeing only the very initial consequences of this pandemic. Countries are starting to respond with their health systems to try to stimulate the economy, but the social, political, and economic consequences will not be seen until later on. We'll be seeing them all throughout this year and probably for a large part of next year. This crisis has shown us that at a domestic level, we are, for example, trying to come together as a society, but we're still not seeing that. Maybe at a community, we're seeing it at a community level, but not necessarily at a country-to-country level. Countries are still robbing each other for example, masks, for ventilators. We're at war for those resources. This is a significant institutional crisis, which takes me to the fifth lesson learned. And that has to do with the weakness of lateralism. Unilateralism was already a way of thinking that was starting to get to a point of crisis. The spaces for international dialogue were starting to deteriorate. Mercosur, for example, has enjoyed a little bit of success, but what we're seeing is that none of these international institutions where spaces for dialogue are supposed to help us, are set up to help us, they're not working. Not even at the United Nations have we been able to see a multilateral response, an effective one, to this crisis. So today we're here and we're saying, where are our leaders? Where are our multilateral leaders? We've had the United Nations for nearly 100 years, and the pandemic is showcasing its weak points. Then, finally, there are new people at the table. And that has to do, for example, we think about 2020, we need to strengthen long-term strategies for climate change. And that our international institutions are pointing us toward the fact that we need to look at carbon markets, we need to be strengthening resilience, climate resilience. But now there are new people at the table. Recovery packages. I don't like talking about recovery because I feel like they point us to the idea that our aim should be business as usual. But recovery packages are on the table as well. The European Union president is saying that the Green Deal should be possibly a part of these recovery packages. Or South Korea, who announced that they are going to announce a new Green Deal. And that has to do with what I want to talk to you about, a new social contract. We need to construct this new social contract. I'm going to talk about that in my conclusion. But we need to think about health and employment. Health and climate, these two were siloed. In COP20, we did talk a little bit about health, but we haven't strengthened the link between these sectors, but it's inevitable.
And this brings us to the role of science. When we think about COP24 and this absurd debate in terms of if...
Thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted to emphasize what you said about the need to preserve our natural habitats. It's actually there that labs are looking for the solution, the vaccine for this current crisis. And talking about ways that our agendas overlap, that's one of them. There's a question, well, two questions that I saw in the chat. I'm going to ask Manuel first. It talks about this shared vision for the future that Paula mentioned, and also our new social contract we want to forge. Manuel, you talked about an institutional crisis and how our institutions have been, Ramiro, I think, was asking this, have been unable to respond. What are national governments' roles when we talk about this new social contract? How do we balance a national response, sovereignty, and the fact that this is a global crisis? Okay, let's start there. Thank you, Ramiro. Let me make a couple of comments responding to what Ivan and Paula said. And I was looking at the questions in the chat, and I'll try to be a bit of a troublemaker and raise some food for thought. When we talk about this new social contract, we tend to become very polarized. Yep, we got to take down the system. We got to create something new. This morning, we talked, probably globalization has been terrible. We just need to plainly reject the process of globalization. Is that realistic? Is that really where we want to go? So, a central element in this debate is how do we create a gradual, reasonable process from the ground up? How do we relate how do we coordinate among governments, for example, as well? I don't think that we can just knock down the system and build a new one and move forward. There was an interview that I heard recently, and the idea there that was raised is that we have to really facilitate cooperation among other values in creating this new process. Let me share a few of my experiences from the climate field. I think that the Paris Climate Agreement was very important, but we need to explain it differently. It's a mechanism. It's an instrument. It's a document that reflects the consensus. But that's not what going to change our local and domestic habits. It's not going to be the tool for change. If we want to continue the slow march towards climate disaster, we can just base ourselves on that document. If we look at Europe, Chile, for example, Costa Rica, they have already committed to carbon neutral measures. But what is it going to look like for countries who aren't going to follow those measures? It doesn't line up. It's irrational. I saw a question in the chat about how to link recovery packages with climate. You know what? We were actually looking for a new era in climate change. What we saw in something from Japan that wasn't really that novel. It didn't change much, but Chile really rebuilt their plan and was much more ambitious. A green plan has to be part of a recovery package. The NDCs have to be factored into this recovery package. And that's a good way to incorporate the climate agenda into the recovery packages. I think from the subnational to the national level, we all need to be involved in a shared vision for 2050. Because in that time, we're going to have to look at biological change, corruption, and face those challenges to create a shared vision for 2050. It's going to be a global mandate. We need those long-term goals. I agree with Paula. Our national governments have a central role in this. But we haven't been able to convince every country to be a part of this fight. For example, in Latin America, the people who are mostly fighting for this are actually non-state actors. So, I think that we can create a shared vision using all of these actors I've just discussed. And Rama mentioned this as well. The relationship between national governments and subnational entities. We have to figure out, especially in Latin America, how to coordinate these two actors. In Europe, they have climate actors who understand that climate is way beyond just climate itself. It has to be connected to economics, to the social aspect. But here in Latin America, we're all segregated, and we have environment ministries that don't understand that they're just a very small piece in the larger machine. We're going to have to strengthen this because in Colombia, for example, they've relaxed environmental measures because of the crisis. And I think that's going to happen in all of our countries, and we're going to figure out how to rise to that challenge. I'll end there because I want to hear other questions from participants. Thank you, Manuel. I want to shine the spotlight on one of the questions that I saw. Manuel, for example, in your presentation, you talked about the role of citizen participation. You highlighted the role of youth. You talked about how, in light of this crisis, we understand that it's an emergency, and that's going to influence how we respond to future challenges. And so the question had to do with how do we get people to volunteer on behalf of the environment? What is the role of the citizen? What is the role of individual action? You know, we've made huge efforts. It's Now, for example, is a campaign that was directed towards individual action. So what is the role of citizen action in this shared vision of the future? We all need to remember that we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. If you see news about this, remember that that was fruit of millions of people in the street saying, nope, governments need to pay attention. Governments need to pay attention to environmental conditions. And that resulted in Earth Day, right? It's an institutionalized day. But that also led to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, among other actual concrete, for example, the Stockholm Summit. Lots of concrete results came out of a citizen-led protest. So all of that to say that the role of the citizen is fundamental. When we are thinking about agreements, whether these are domestic or international agreements, conventions, for example, there is a risk. There's a risk that actually when we come to an agreement, it acts as an anesthesia. It actually dampens down on citizen action. We have to make sure that For example, the Paris Agreement doesn't actually bring activism to a halt. We were able to come to that agreement, but what we need to make sure is that those agreements don't weaken activism. It's been several years since that agreement. And what are we seeing now? A disillusionment with these international processes. What do we see? As I said in my in what I said earlier, we're not recognizing the climate situation as an actual emergency. This is a historical moment. What we need to see is a resurgence of climate activism. That activism shouldn't be just at an international level. It needs to be at a local level, and we're seeing that. There are Friday strikes in Europe that young people are putting on and participating in. There are some areas that are more aware of what is going on. In Latin America, for example, we are not a part of that process. We are not encouraging, we are not motivating our citizens to participate in that local activism. COVID, which is one of its, maybe one of the only positive thing that's coming out of it, is that it has the ability to unify agendas. We're able to integrate health agendas with climate. The amount of awareness raising that is going to come out of this pandemic is going to motivate a new wave of activism, and that's going to be very important for climate. This agenda has several elements within it. People are going to have to participate from different angles, whether, what is the rural agenda? What is the farmer agenda? And that's going to create synergies among sectors. Thank you, Manuel. That responded very clearly to the question. We're going to see citizen action. Oh, I'm sorry, I just wanted to interrupt it. There's a before, but we don't know what the after looks like. No, I'm talking about an after that is imbued with much more purpose. When we look at our government leaders and how they are facing the crisis, what we're seeing is really they're just focused on getting less number of people to die. Governments are focused on this, and it's great. We need leaders who are focused on that. But we need other people thinking about what does post-crisis life look like? Because life is going to continue. And we don't want just the same old responses. We need people in governments really thinking about post-crisis. They need to be setting up something that's sustainable. We only have people focused on a death count, which is, of course, terrible, but there needs to be a broader focus. This future forecasting, we need to do it right now because economic decisions for the future are being made now. Those economic decisions are going to be decisive for the next decade. They are, if we make good ones, they're going to set us on the correct path for reducing emissions. But if bad ones are taken, we will have very little ability to really face and make progress on the climate change fight. Manuel, you mentioned the global agenda. I will come back to that, but we have a very important friend connected here. Yolanda Catrabatse, she is part of one of the working groups I'm a member of. Yolanda, you were commenting that the quarantine conditions are actually targeting more the middle class than the large swath of people in our countries. Yolanda is working with the Ecuadorian government to try to think about how to confront a pandemic while taking into account the realities of our most vulnerable sectors. Would you mind? It would be wonderful if you would even turn on your camera, but could you share a little bit? Oh, it's so good to hear from you all. Everyone who's spoken has really inspired us and shed some light on these complicated circumstances. There's a lot of diversity of thought, of sectors. What's my perspective? Well, it's going to be an Ecuadorian perspective. The urban and suburban settings are the big centers of these crises. In the rural areas, there's actually less resources to overcome this wave. For example, children who aren't in school don't have the internet connectivity that we have in the city, and so they can't continue learning online. The majority of parents are living hand to mouth. They earn a daily wage. They are having to choose between hunger and fear of the virus. They have to leave the home. They have to at least make some sort of income to be able to feed themselves. So here we are seeing that inequalities are being, it's easy to see the inequalities in the midst of this crisis, in the midst of this crisis. Manuel, you talked about solidarity. It's really during a crisis that we really come to see that Latin American trait that is showing one's emotion, the willingness to support the most vulnerable people in our society. That is our legacy. And we see that in several sectors. We see that in low-income people, to people who have more resources, everyone is saying, how can I help? And that catapults certain processes that turn into movements, support movements among different sectors of society. But we're also understanding the weaknesses in our governmental systems. In suburban neighborhoods, it doesn't matter to them one bit if the police comes, the army comes, and threatens with, for example, fines if they continue to meet together. No, they continue carrying out their meetings. It doesn't matter if they are infected or not. It's not that it doesn't matter to them. I think they just don't have a full awareness of the impact of contagion. There are people who know they have the viruses and they are still moving about and spreading the virus to other people. And, when you have a virus, you become almost a killer because you are spreading the virus to someone and that person may die. And so what we see is that there's been so little investment, not only in education, in health, but in other areas as well. And that's where we see that there's not a strong understanding of the impact of these viral processes. We have to strengthen our governments, right? But beyond that, we need more citizen participation in government. Because there's governments and societies, right? And governments are trying to solve all the problems without citizen participation, and they just don't have the accumulated experience that we see in civil society, and that can be a huge part of the solution when we are collectively facing these crises. Oh, thank you. That was wonderful. Can I go ahead and interrupt, Ram? I agree. I I actually, though, have a question about education levels. Excuse me, solidarity levels. You know, in the past, we've just seen solidarity built around the national anthem. We see it pop up every once in a while when there are elections, but we're not sure that solidarity is going to be the result of this crisis, or a solidarity that's stronger than the superficial one we've seen in the past. We also don't have enough information. There's discrimination. We don't have all the information, and so that leads to, excuse me, racism that we see in social media day to day. How can we actually create meaningful solidarity? You know, and of course, we think that we can display solidarity when we're quarantined at home, but I want a real solidarity. You know, and this is not one that's built around one's favorite soccer team or around the government, but I want it to be an active solidarity, and I haven't seen that quite yet. Manuel, you know what? We may not see that organically. We'll probably have to take some measurements following the crisis. There are lots of things that are happening right now that we can't actually track and measure because we're all stuck at home. We do see symptoms of lack of solidarity, signs of lack of solidarity. But of course, those are the loudest because those are the ones that maybe the media is covering. But what aren't captured is that there's the solidarity that we are seeing in social sectors that aren't covered by the media. And those, I think, are going to be permanent and important. I wanted to really connect what the two of you are both saying. Manuel said, we don't know what post-crisis is going to look like. So that means that's good news. The future is open, completely open. This is such a deep crisis, a deep structural crisis. And there are now lots of options on the table. We want to see cooperation, solidarity, multilateralism that actually cooperates and functions. A future where there is citizen participation, where there's investment in climate, health, education, technological innovation. That's all on the table. That is a possibility. Christiana, the future that we choose, to paraphrase the title, if you haven't read that, I would recommend that book. This is the decade from now and up until 2030. If we want more solidarity, we want more sustainability, now we need to make the structural changes so that we don't miss the opportunity to actually have an impact on climate change. Because if we don't, it's just going to be managing the fallout. That future is open. Okay. We've gone a little bit over time. So let's go ahead and close. Let's go ahead and close. With who? So what we're going to do is we're going to kick it to. Well, first I want to thank Manuel. And I also wanted to pass it over to Guillermo. Thanks for giving me a heads up. Not really.